Caliban, the frame that was labeled as mid, trash, etc, etc. Well, guess what? He is in his villain arc now because once again, Pablo has cooked with his rework. Caliban is in a much better place right now. He is basically a summoner frame, which is a really cool concept. Not only that, Caliban's abilities have now been changed to a new status effect called Tau. Tau damage is basically sentient damage. For each Tau status effect, enemies will receive a 10% status chance vulnerability, capping at 100% with 10 stacks. This basically just increases the likelihood an enemy receives a status effect when being hit. Pairing this with weapons that have good status chance and status damage, and you have a very deadly combo with Caliban. So we're going to go over everything regarding Caliban's rework and showcase to you how much better he is and if he is worth building. Let's begin with the video. Firstly, we talk about Caliban's passive, and honestly his passive is just adaptation. You and your allies will gain adaptive armor that builds up damage resistance up to 50%. It is very important to know that Caliban's passive will not stack with adaptation, and the higher damage reduction buff will take preference. Caliban's first ability is called Razor Gyre. Dash forward in a spinny vortex of death, and enemies that are struck will be inflicted with Tau status effects. Razor Gyre will also have a 25% chance to apply Tau to enemies that are struck. Each enemy hit will restore Caliban's health, which can then flow into his shields and overshields when at full health. And it will now grant 25% of the energy cost per enemy hit. The energy refund does scale inversely with ability efficiency, meaning less efficiency will actually increase the amount of energy refunded to you. You can also now loot and pick up energy and health orbs during Razor Gyre's animation. It's important to note that casting speed will not affect activation and deactivation speed. And Razor Gyre will synergize with her second ability called Sentient Wrath. Now Sentient Wrath is actually a really cool ability. Stomp the ground, sending out a radial wave of destruction. Those not killed by the initial blast are lifted into the air and they will have damage on ability applied to them. Sentient Wrath will also have a 100% status chance to apply 1 Tau proc per cast. This ability is actually huge in terms of the Tau damage being applied and also the damage vulnerability being applied to enemies as well. Not only that, but enemies that are lifted with Sentient Surge synergize with Razor Gyre, giving you increased status chance to apply Tau onto enemies. Sentient Wrath is quite important for Caliban's entire kit in terms of the damage vulnerability, as this is just an incredibly powerful debuff for all sources of damage, whether that's damage from your weapons or your abilities. It's also good to know that the lifted status effect does apply for condition overload type mods. Also, Sentient Surge does not need line of sight to track and hit targets, and it will also pass through any terrain and obstacle. And Sentient Surge no longer has a target cap, where previously it had a cap of 16. We then move on to Lethal Progeny. Now this is a big one, so stick with me here. Caliban is now a summoner frame with this ability alone. You can now summon 3 types of sentient units. The Conculists, who focus on melee damage, Ortholists, who focus on ranged attacks, and Summulists, who summon their own minions who provide shield protection for the squad. You can cycle through them and cast one type at a time. You cannot mix them up per cast or have one of each type. So you are committing to one type of summon per cast. For the Conculists and Ortholists, you will summon 3 at a time, and then you will summon one Summulist who will then summon its own minions. You can recast the ability if you accidentally choose the wrong one. Let's talk about Conculists first. They are the melee focused sentients. They are pretty much the main damage dealer in a sense. They have a tornado ability that lasts 10 seconds with a 4-second cooldown. The tornadoes now do 1000 damage instead of the previous amount, which was 50, but their tornado damage doesn't scale with any mods, which is not the best for steelpath, let's be real here. And Conculus will also apply Slash, which does a decent amount of damage when paired with other things, but it's not the best. It's okay, put it that way. Conculus now casts Fusion Strike, his 4th ability, alongside you to basically just give you this huge amount of ground cover when casting Fusion Strike. But the Conculus will cast Fusion Strike at a 0.5 times of the effectiveness compared to you as Caliban. Ortholists are the sniper boys. They are the long range summons, and Ortholists only inflict Tau damage and Tau status effects onto enemies. They have 2 fire modes, free moving while shooting basically, and then they have a stationary artillery form. Their default weapon has a 100% status chance, guaranteeing Tau status effects, while the artillery fire mode has a 300% status chance, and this will not change with any mods. Ortholists are pretty much your primers for Tau damage. You kind of cast them and have them in the background, just forget about them, shooting artillery, applying a bunch of tile status effects onto enemies. Summonists are the last type of sentients. You will summon one Summonist that will then open up a portal which will summon shield generating Chloralists. I'm really struggling to say these names. Now these little guys' job is to simply just aggro and distract your enemies while recharging you and your allies' shields. Summonists will summon 6 Chloralists. If a little guy dies, then the Summonist will just poop out another one. It's important to note that the Chloralists have the most target priority and aggro potential. Now, the question you're probably asking is which summon is the best? This is entirely up to you and what you like. You can hard focus on the Summonist to survive more, or if you want to have fun, you can use the Auralist to snipe enemies, priming them with tile status effects. Or, if you like melee Sentients dealing damage, especially when pairing it with Sentient Surge's damage vulnerability, then run that. This ultimately comes down to your testing and what you find to be the most comfortable for you. We then move on to Caliban's 4th ability, which is Fusion Strike. This is Caliban's big boy ability. Cast out 3 beams that converge onto one point, causing a massive explosion in the middle. Each beam will apply tile damage. Caliban will be invulnerable and immobile when casting Fusion Strike, but you are able to aim the reticle and move your mouse. Enemies that are affected by beams will detonate for a bunch of tile damage. The beams will armor strip enemies, and when they converge, it will create a field, and any enemies inside this field or who walk into the field will lose some of their armor and shields permanently. But it's not an overtime effect, it's a one-time instance. So if you don't fully armor strip them with the beams, you'll have to recast the ability to fully armor strip. If you have 200% strength, you can fully armor strip in one cast. This is pretty good considering Caliban now does tile damage, meaning you have increased status chance and you now armor strip, and you also apply damage vulnerability. He is pretty strong at the moment with certain weapons and synergy. And like I mentioned earlier, his Conquerors will also have their own mini beams when you cast Fusion Strike. You can also recast Fusion Strike to have multiple different fallout fields. And that concludes Caliban's abilities. Before we go further, if you could hit that like button, it really helps me out with the video. Thank you so much, my lovely and kind tenno. Now let's move on to how to play him. Caliban's gameplay loop is pretty simple. As always, we will be going over how to play him as a base frame and no Helminth. When you first hop into your mission, you want to cast your summons first. From my experience, I find Orthalists to be pretty mid. Some may like them for status priming, but I tend to focus on the Conquerors and then his Summulus to survive better. When you see enemies, you can cast your second ability to lift them, making you pretty much untouchable. Cast your first to dash straight through them, gain extra shield, and it's also a really good movement ability to glide through your missions. When you see a nice group, you can cast your 4th ability to armor strip, and if you have Conquerors, you can actually nuke weaker enemies in steelpath with your Fusion Strike. Remember, you need 200% strength to fully armor strip in one cast. You can cycle between each of the summons, but that is his general gameplay loop. He's actually really tanky now with the Summoners and their insane shield regen. And also, his second ability is absolutely elite for crowd control. The fact that you can pick up pretty much any enemy instead of Eximus units, of course, or enemies with Overguard, that alone is just amazing. His overall survivability is so much better at the moment with his rework. I actually really enjoy playing Caliban with his base kit and no Helminth. I think it works perfectly well together, and I feel like it synergizes very well. His first ability is really good to keep himself alive, even though it does no damage. It's a very good oh shit button when things get rough. For the new players who have received a free Caliban, how would you go about building him? Like I always do for the super early players, you won't have a lot of capacity, so run any aura that you have available. Then put Continuity, Intensify, Flow, and Stretch. Just these 4 mods will suffice in the super early game. Then when you progress further into the star chart, you need to get your hands on Energy Nexus, which is a 5 platinum mod, and this is incredibly important for early game energy sustain. Equilibrium for even more energy sustain, and Augur Message for more duration, and Transient Fortitude. This is a simple star chart setup that should feel pretty good in terms of energy sustain and balancing every stat that Caliban needs. For the Steel Path players, you have a choice. If you want to run Adaptation and override his passive, then yes, you technically can do that. Or you can opt for Rolling Guard, which I chose to go for, as you will already get the 50% damage reduction from your passive. I did go for Brief Respite just in case your shields break, although you can run Growing Power or Corrosive Projection. We run Stretch for range, Equilibrium, Augur Secrets, Transient Fortitude, Flow, Streamline, and Continuity. Remember, you do not need primed mods. For the Arcanes, I went for Arcane Aegis and Molt Augmented. This is what the setup looks like. I find this for general steelpath gameplay and endurance runs to be super comfortable if you don't want to subsume anything on him. Arcane Aegis helps you a lot with your survivability, so I would highly recommend investing into it. It's going to make Caliban feel a lot better. Caliban does scale quite well with strength. I find a healthy amount of around 200 to 280% is the sweet spot to help you build around his other stats. And that concludes how to build and play Caliban as a no Helminth setup. Let's now talk about Helminth setups. This was difficult because I personally don't see Caliban with another subsume besides Nourish and Raw. There are other options out there, of course, but the reason for Nourish and Raw is simply because they affect Caliban's summons, ultimately buffing their damage. And the nice thing is subsuming Raw or Nourish over your first ability will also allow you to somewhat have a weapons platform setup. So it's a win-win overall. You get to buff your summons and you get to buff your weapons damage. We run the exact same build for both of them. We use Rolling Guard, Stretch, Equilibrium, Augur Secrets, Blind Rage, Flow, Streamline, and Continuity. Arcane Aegis and then a flexible Arcane slot. Remember, we subsume over Caliban's first ability for these setups. And this is what the final build would look like as a whole. Remember, you can switch around the setup to your liking, but don't feel pressured that you have to run these exact mods. I find Nourish to be particularly good with the Conculus, and the Raw build being really OP with Fusion Strike, buffing the explosion damage and nuking groups of enemies. It's incredibly satisfying, especially when you pair it with the Conculus who add even more explosions. In terms of other Helminth setups, it's entirely up to you. You can do Zarta's Whisper, Wrathful Advance for a melee focus setup, a grouping ability for your summons works really well, but personally, I find, for pure comfort, the Raw and Nourish subsume work the best and synergize the most with his kit. If you're finding you are dying with him and you want to be ultra tanky, you could run Eclipse over his first ability and run Lunar Eclipse for the 75% damage reduction, run Arcane Aegis, as well as Adaptation. It's overkill, but this will be a shield tanking setup which will pretty much make you immortal with Caliban, considering his shield regen from the Summonlists. This now leads me on to Archon Shards with Caliban. He needs at least 2 casting speed shards in my opinion, and then strength shards through and through. You can also go duration if you like, but at least 2 strength shards would be really good. In terms of synergies that work with Caliban, the thing is his summons and his kit allow you to have a lot of flexibility actually. What I have found to work pretty well is pairing him with the Hound to prime enemies or another companion that can prime enemies, and making use of high status chance weapons because they will go hand in hand with the new Tau status effect. Weapons like the Cedo, Teneglaxian, Phantasma, for example, just to name a few. Or just simply any status chance weapon will shine a lot more with Caliban. Not to mention the damage vulnerability you get from his second ability, which will just buff your overall damage regardless. I have tried Nautilus with him to pull enemies in, but the pull from the Nautilus behaves really weirdly with Sentient Wrath. They are kind of stuck in a slow motion animation. It's just weird. And they, for some reason, just fly up as well. They just go straight up. It's annoying. So Nautilus, unfortunately, is not the best idea. Although you can subsume a pull ability with Caliban, that does work to pull enemies in and then allows your Conculus to kind of use their spinning ability, hitting multiple enemies at once. It's really nice to focus on that summoner playstyle. It's not a bad idea to pair Caliban with a pull mechanic of some sort. For my final thoughts on the Caliban rework, he is in a much better place right now. He's not super broken or anything like that. He's not S tier, but he has been bumped up to at least a B or A tier depending on how you build him. His whole playstyle just feels really good and smooth at the moment. The only thing that I do not like about his kit is the Conculus attack slowly, in my opinion. What I mean by that is they kind of do these bursts of hitting enemies often and then kind of just stand there and stare at them for like a couple of seconds, which kind of sucks. I wish they just went ham on any enemy that they saw, which I think would make the summons feel a lot better. Overall, a really solid frame, and if you enjoy the summoner playstyle, you will really enjoy Caliban. Definitely worth investing Farmer into him since we all have received a free Caliban, so there is no excuse about farming him basically. Until the 16th of October, of course. How are you finding the new Caliban rework? What are your thoughts on him? And are you enjoying the Kome update? Let me know in the comments below. I have also made a Kome video if you would like to go and check that one out as well. As always, a massive thank you to all of our channel members and a special thank you to Darwin, Fish, I have no idea how to say your name, Joshua, Villa, Caden, Trum, Shakiro, Gilbert, Edison Yard, and Tythrax. Thank you so much for your ongoing support. All right, enjoy your summons. Bye.